Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for today's CBAA webinar, Your Station and Cybersecurity and Introduction. Thanks very much to our friends at Technorama and CMTO for providing their support for today's session. I'll just turn on my camera so you can have a bit of a look at me. Obviously that's going to be a very, very scary thing, and apologies in advance for that. That's just how we run things here at our webinars. We're very lucky to be able to call on the expertise of both John Moses from Technorama and Dan Callahan from the Community Radio Network for today's session. A cybersecurity incident can happen to individuals and organisations of all shapes and sizes. Cybersecurity management doesn't have to be difficult, but it does require thought and planning. And you won't get much more thought and planning than you do from Dan and John. I'm here in the CBAA offices at the moment. It's busy, busy, busy. Phones are ringing. So I'm going to mute myself and throw it over to both John and Dan to get started on today's session. Before I do so, everyone who's there in the chat box introducing themselves and the station that they're representing, please feel free to keep doing so. It's wonderful to have you there. And of course, we will be taking questions all throughout the session today. Our presenters will be responding to all of it, but the main bit of Q&A will be at the conclusion of the presentation. John and Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danny. So you probably want to know where this came from, and the first reminder that I had, and it was a really important reminder, was in March when Nine Network got hacked very, very suddenly. Nine Network is a big organization with television and newspapers and many staff. And they're in a position where when the challenge came, they could call on large numbers of internal resources to help bail themselves out. It took something over a month for them to get under control. It only took them a day before they were back on air substantially, but it was a really serious business impact. And this started me thinking about what happens if it's your station that gets attacked, and what's the chance that you're going to be able to quickly get yourself back into order. Now, for some of the bigger stations, which are well resourced, the chances are pretty good. For some of the smaller stations, and there are sort of something in excess of 450 stations in Australia, pretty difficult, and this could be a major challenge. So this is really a first step. In 1 hour, Dan and I can't possibly cover everything. We can barely scratch the surface. So what we're going to do today is try and position why this is such an important topic and what you should be thinking about. We'll go through some case studies and some examples at the start, just sort of give you an idea of what is actually happening out there and what has happened in the past, and we'll keep referring to those. But the thing to bear in mind is that community radio is a target. You are visible, you are a broadcaster, you are of appeal to many criminals, some of whom will want to go after you for your money, some of whom will want to use you as an outlet, some of whom will want to attack you just because they can and because you are visible. And we'll talk a bit about how you can avoid this and how you can handle it, because it's a two-pronged thing that you need to deal with when you're thinking about cybercrime. And we will focus on what it is that you should do if you are in the unfortunate position of being attacked. And I'll give you the disclaimer right now. Dan and I are not the big experts that Danny just made us out to be. We know a bit, and between the two of us, we've had some experience, but there are plenty of other experts who we would want to bring to the table, and we will do that as time progresses, because we've started thinking about, you know, is this a one-shot webinar? No, this isn't. This is very much a journey that we're only just starting on. So Dan and I are going to be here hosting this. We will take your questions largely at the end, so just queue them up, and then we'll go through and see what we can answer or what we're going to have to flick past to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. So let's start with a bit of what has happened in the past. Dan.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think to echo John's message just then, neither of us would claim to be cybersecurity experts or anything, but we are both technologists, and I see quite a few attendees are. And I think in this day and age, we've all got to think sort of security first. Certainly there's, you know, we're busy people. It's easy to sort of plug something in, get up and running. But then there's a whole section of setting passwords and setting access controls, limiting who has access to these devices or shares or servers. That can take quite a while to work through. So it's a challenge.
There's a lot of very techie stuff that we're not going to cover today, because today is mostly about awareness, and therefore it's aimed more at managers. Sometime in the future, we'll start talking about what it is that we actually do.
That's right. I'm thinking it's been further down the track that some of these would be worthy of sessions in their own right, some more practical hands-on things.
Yeah,
but yeah, we were sort of discussing between ourselves a few case studies that have struck us recently or over the years. You know, we don't sort of want to put the frighteners on people, but I think all of us need to be aware that things can and do happen to businesses of all sizes, and certainly radio stations aren't immune. The two images here are taken from a couple of headlines that I've sort of captured over the years. Both of these refer to some specific instances and a specific attack, you'd say, on the station infrastructure, in this case, studio transmitter links. A modern method of getting your signal to the transmitter is via IP links. There's quite a few manufacturers of equipment that have internet connected devices that'll send the signal between one and the other. But those sort of on the internet, if they are, those can quite easily be discovered. There's in fact sort of websites on the internet, not the dark web or anything like that, sort of that you can just Google and find, that will sort of list pages and pages of devices like these on the internet, which in this case, I won't mention the manufacturer, but in this case, attackers were able to discover these devices, have a pretty good guess at what the password was. In both of these instances, they were either the default password that's listed very clearly in the manufacturer documentation, or I believe one of them, no password at all. And in getting into those devices, they were able to see sort of the live stream, upload media to these codecs, the little SD card, and play back messages of their own choosing. In one case, it was sort of anti-Trump material, which is about the time of the Trump first election. And in the right-hand one there, a little bit more sus material, half-an-hour podcast, I believe it was, set to loop, talking about a particular kink that, yeah, was sort of broadcast on several stations for some hours, I believe, until people were able to recover. Yeah, so sort of exposed devices and password securities, that's definitely a theme that'll come up through this. Certainly not the only sort of front that we need to be careful of, though.
And that's an obvious one. The things that Dan is talking about there, you could think of as appliances. So the box that you just plug in, you plug the internet in on one side, you plug audio in on the other side, and it just works. And they are appliances. There's no programming or setup involved in many cases, but these are devices that have defaults and are well known. And as soon as something is well known, it can be deconstructed by a potential hacker and then attacked. Not all attacks are as simple as that. This is a really good one because this demonstrates something that might not be obvious at all, which is that not every attack is instant or I've got you, now pay up. This is an attack that happened over a period of time, and it was very, very carefully and cleverly orchestrated once the attacker discovered that they could get in. It's an organization, a French TV broadcaster, TV5 Monde, and you can see on the picture on the top right-hand side there of what they were able to do. This is the reception that would normally have lots of channels of television. One of the things that the attacker did was plunge the network into black. But having gained control of the network, they then used the network to broadcast their own messaging. In this case, it was jihadist propaganda. It really doesn't matter what the message is. The attacker had in fact taken over the broadcast, leaving the broadcaster pretty much helpless to control what was going out to their own customers. And in this particular case, the goal was right from the very beginning to do some sabotage. So the attacker was able to get in via a VPN. They found a backdoor that had been left open by a contractor on a VPN. That enabled them to get to, of all things, some camera control servers. So TV stations have automation. They got to the camera control servers, which had an elevated level of authority. From there, they were able to get into Active Directory and then create some Active Directory entries that gave them, as the attacker, very high levels of privilege within the organization. What was interesting, and in the post-mortem it became obvious, is that the attacker was creating user IDs that were in English, whereas in fact the rest of the naming was all in French. And if somebody had noticed that, they would have gone, wait a minute, who created this? They also, very interestingly, as they were cruising around the organization, looking at different machines, found the IT department's wiki, where the IT department had very carefully curated a large amount of information that might be useful if there was a problem. The attacker actually then used this information to work out how even more properly to negotiate the organization's IT infrastructure. And they did this all over a period of 3 months. So it wasn't just, oh, we're in, let's do something. It was, let's be very measured about this and let's get to an end point without tipping anybody off. And that is very typical of today's high threat attackers. And that was certainly the case at Nine Network, where it wasn't just a sudden over the night attack, it was prepared in advance and then triggered. And the diagram on the right shows, in fact, the timeline that was unpacked by the post-mortem. Scary stuff. Dan.
Unmute myself. Yeah, this one is sort of another radio-specific incident, but ransomware, I think, has been getting headlines for a good couple of years now. Is sort of highly prevalent across industries, absolutely. I think whereas John's last example is sort of quite targeted, ransomware in general can be sort of much more random, I think. We'll talk about it a little bit later about sort of who's a target and why, but a lot of it can be just entirely random and chance, really, that someone at your organization happens to click an email. But yeah, in this case, ransomware in general sort of gets into a system and then starts locking or encrypting all the files on various systems. That can be sort of the data itself, or sort of configuration files that will sort of render servers and devices sort of useless, really. It can sort of brick them, but generally it'll ask for a fee to be paid to provide a decryption key so you can get access to everything again. In this case, the last line of this article here is sort of, I think, partway through their dealings with this, sort of up to day 33 of a ransomware attack. In this case, once the ransomware was in the system, they were able to sort of restore systems, but then other systems would sort of come along and re-encrypt everything. So I think the solution for them was to wipe absolutely everything in the end and pretty much start afresh. So yeah, it's a long-running impact on that one.
So what types of cyber threats might you actually get? And when we looked at it, we came down to 3 basic categorizations. The first one is just somebody discovers something and goes off and is just a bit opportunistic. There was a really good 1983 film, War Games, starring Matthew Broderick, that showed this. A kid, a hacker, gets into what he thinks is a game site, starts playing the game. What he doesn't realize is it is actually a war game, and the plot of the movie is he sort of nearly precipitates World War III. So it wasn't a deliberate attempt to get into something, but an opportunistic discovery, which can still do a very large amount of damage in the hands of an opportunistic agent. More specifically targeted towards doing nasty things is the criminal element. And generally this is out for profit and theft. So they're going to try and get something from you. They're going to try and extract data that you've got on the system and use that somehow. And we see many examples of people who've copied off large address lists and then spray those around the internet, selling the address list, for instance, on the dark web to be used by other people, or simply going after some of your money, extracting something straight from a bank account or whatever. There are many different approaches which involve a criminal element and are there particularly to line their own pockets. The most common one of these is the big spray, where an organization just sends out a squillion emails, and not all of those emails will be clicked, but some of them will. And it doesn't have to be every email, every targeted email that gets clicked. It just needs to be enough to support the business model and make the activity worthwhile. Then there are the people who are in it very specifically to make money. These are the people who are maybe they're using one of the service software as a service in the cloud, hacker ransomware packages, where really they just want to make money, and they're running a perfectly solid business model in which something happens, you pay them, they release you, they make money, life continues. Maybe the most difficult to accept, but this is what is certainly appearing now, and I don't want to sort of oversell this, but it's real, is now the concept of warfare without bullets. This is the state-based actor who might be trying to destabilize an entire economy. And whilst that sounds like the thing of movies and bad scripts, it is in fact now proving to be very much the case. And there are a number of hacks happening at very, very high levels, which are really country to country, and where the attacker is seeking some sort of political dominance. Is that likely to be what happens to a community radio station? No, it's not. But here's the thing. Organizations get caught in the crossfire. And so your station might not be the subject of the attack. It might just be your station is the innocent bystander that gets caught in an attack. And it doesn't matter whether you're the bystander or the subject, the attack is still the same. It's real.
I was going to add to that. Just this morning, we've had sort of a few emails through our organizational email, sort of flagged as, likely malicious, sort of bad attachments or sort of indicators of scam activity. So it's common. I think it's sort of daily for a lot of organizations, really. So I think here we're just going to sort of mention a few of the sort of mechanisms and motives and effects that the intent of some of these attacks. We've sort of talked about malware, which uses, ransomware, which uses encryption to lock down data and machines. In most cases, either preventing access to it or, in the case of devices, making them unusable in a lot of cases. Preventing logins, preventing data from being copied and captured and turned around and used. The other motives are certainly financial compromise. This might be a more active kind of attempt to get financial details or records or banking details. There's many ways to make that happen. Certainly then phishing and scams would be another one. Again, sort of an attempt to sort of hoover up company data, certainly IP and intellectual property, or used to sort of give you a bad name, give you a bad reputation. And for a radio specific example we mentioned before, those case studies of an attacker being able to hijack sort of station signal and put other material to air to shut it down entirely. It's all sort of possible, quite possible. So turning to some of the specifics for broadcasters, I think probably one of the more common things that our stations have been up against, certainly we've had a couple of reports, certainly not naming names, but a few stations that have been subject to cyber incidents. So there's many aspects that could be affected in this, but probably the headline stuff is considering what might happen to your most obvious sort of core business, the broadcasting signal. Certainly, I don't think there's many stations these days that are not using PC playout systems to put material to air, sort of thousands of music assets, all as data, ones and zeros on your machine. Quite likely that's part of a larger network, sort of having all the office computers, the media servers, the production studios, all hanging off the same network. Certainly in the case of ransomware and sort of encryption attacks, that will spread quite quickly through a station's network. So sort of entry through one point, getting to your playout systems and sort of crippling your playout, which would have very, very obvious on-air effects and hard to recover from. I think possibly what's more important, and this might be for discussion, is thinking about sort of the business data that you've got as well, and the true valuable material that your station is holding. Certainly for day-to-day operations, losing access to your financial services or business systems would be incredibly disruptive. Likewise, a lot of communication systems, whether it's your email or perhaps your VoIP and SIP phones, might exist on more sort of commodity kind of platforms, server-based platforms. They could quite easily be knocked out. But then I think the really dangerous stuff is probably your financial records and your member and volunteer data material. Yeah, between those two instances, I'm probably of the opinion that your music libraries can be rebuilt. That material exists elsewhere. Usually, you might have to re-record a whole lot of IDs and CSAs and special programs, but can probably be recreated and get you back on air fairly quickly, that stuff. What would be really hard to do without would be your business records, your financial details, and certainly your member and volunteer data. I think that stuff, once it's gone, you'd be in a lot of trouble sort of trying to recreate it. So I think any sort of strategy that a station might put into place sort of really needs to identify what's your most critical data, what's going to be the hardest to replace.
But of course, it's not only the data that has to be replaced. And this is one of the things that became very apparent with the attack on 9 Network. Mostly material wasn't encrypted. What was encrypted was the business systems that controlled access to the material. And in the early days, they had no idea if material had been encrypted or not, because the systems that would allow them to index, find, retrieve were all locked, and therefore they couldn't get to anything, as were also all the business systems that drove the station, like the newsroom system that not only controls all the scripting, but then controls all the cameras, controls all of the what vision do you see next. So as organizations become more and more sophisticated in their use of IT as the core of the organization, you become more and more susceptible to even a slight perturbation in your business, let alone it's all completely knocked out. And that's a major challenge. So you've got to think about, as Dan said, your phones, your on-air automation system, your accounting records, your membership databases, absolutely everything could be there, but if you can't get to it, it's pretty much useless. So how do they get in? And there's a large number of ways. You know some of them. We thought it would be worthwhile just putting them all together in the one place. The most common that we know of is email, and the phishing example is the most. I cannot tell you last month how many notes I got telling me that my Norton subscription was about to expire. I don't have a Norton subscription, but some people would, and it looked good enough. And some of the phishing emails look really, really good. Some of them are obviously bad. Some of them look very, very good. And people will get fooled. Broadcast appliances. So Dan was talking before about the studio transmitter links. Any box that just does a job, but which has an IT core and which has known code and which has been out for a little while, can be reverse engineered, and therefore exposures inside the code and backdoors and other things created by the manufacturers can be compromised, can be used as gateways. VPN, virtual private network. If it's not sufficiently secure, if the software actually isn't good enough, or indeed if passwords are just left lying around, VPN provides a gateway into your organization. So as soon as somebody's got a VPN access to your organization, they're on the inside, not on the outside. Loose passwords. Who was it who had passwords on Post-it notes in the back of a Zoom conference on the wall? Really? But you might not notice. Inappropriate personal access. So people who have the master passwords but maybe don't need it, and passwords aren't changed often enough. Now, this is a real challenge inside a radio station. Nothing is worse than not being able to log on to a machine because it has a highly secure password, unnecessarily secure maybe, and therefore the station can't do its main job, which is to be on air and broadcast program. But having access, so make it easy to get to your on-air studio gear, but don't necessarily make it easy to get to the servers that are behind that by having the same password on everything. Internet of Things devices, and we've all seen those. Every so often, Aldi has the special on the Wi-Fi controlled PowerPoint outlet. Those things connect to your network. You have given them your network password, SSID and network password, so that they can get onto your encrypted network. You do have that, don't you? Is there a back door into that device that would enable somebody to hack via the device into your network? And that's a really difficult one. Who knows? You probably don't. A bit of research before you suddenly plaster the place full of IoT devices might be a smart thing. Shareware, a common attack vector, particularly if it's been downloaded in a password cracked form. You really don't know what else has been done inside it. Porn sites, well, I hate to say it, it's obvious. And I did once spring somebody in the studio idly going through porn sites on the same machine that the audio was playing out from. You would think that would be a no-no, but clearly somebody was very bored. Sites that look legitimate, and you can be caught by this. Carefully crafted URLs, and especially in emails where the visible part of the URL looks legitimate, but when you hover over it, you discover, in fact, it's nothing like that. If you hover over a URL for Microsoft.com and the actual address ends in .ru, it's probably fake. Can't do much about this other than tell you about it. Lots of the pages that you download have a single pixel graphic. Just fetching that graphic, which goes off to a site, tells somebody that you've downloaded the page. TeamViewer and similar access software can be a really easy way to get into your organization. And many of the hacks that Dan and I looked at, something like TeamViewer or VNC were the first gateways where somebody had just left a VNC session logged on or a TeamViewer session logged on. Somebody was able to go past and get the next step and then wander off before they were noticed and then do the work somewhere else. And finally, crafted SQL calls, and good SQL will avoid this, but it's one of the challenges for people like eBay, where constantly people will be trying to hack by putting crafted SQL into a search query to see if they can bust through. And your website might in fact still have incorrectly open backdoors that would allow somebody to crack the website via an attack with a suitably crafted SQL call. So now we get into a bit of a discussion. What on earth can you do? And we've discussed this a lot. And there are no right answers, are there?
No, that's right. But we've discussed it a lot. But so has every other business of every other size around the world for quite some time now. So there's some fairly clearly identified strategies and methods that can. We need to stress that absolutely nothing can save you 100% of the time.
No.
There's just sort of too many different ways, but there's certainly a number of things that can greatly reduce sort of the risk that you're facing.
It's sort of the nothing is foolproof because fools are so ingenious, and everything will succumb to an attack that is sufficiently persistent.
That's right. So sort of the list that we're presenting here is pulled from a range of sources, but generally the items listed here are in sort of the national advisory bodies of several sort of countries and big businesses as being sort of the most effective sort of measures you can put in place. So email, we've sort of talked about the amount of material that can just hit an inbox every day. There's a few aspects to that. We'll spend a bit more time later on talking about just sort of general awareness, treating every email with a bit of suspicion. Are you expecting it? Who's it from? What does their sort of URL look like? Is it just immediately suspicious? But some of it is very, very good. So there's ways around that. In some of the cases, there's, I think sort of a key one is using trustworthy email services. Any of the big email providers, Google, Microsoft, very few others have sort of fairly sophisticated malware and spam and scam sort of reporting and identification kind of systems built into their thing. So it'll, in a lot of cases, it'll be pinged before it even reaches you.
Yeah, they're fairly heavily motivated to try and filter that stuff before it gets to you. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So a couple of months back, Optus made a change which prevented me from getting the I am testing myself message from my UPS cards. That was being treated as spam, and suddenly it wasn't. But there was a period in the middle where I would have made the virus filtering go away because it was blocking important messages. Fortunately, they improved that. Certainly keeping your network private and making sure that you've got adequate firewalling. So even domestically, most households now with the devices that have been provided by NBN and your chosen provider will have a router that has a reasonable firewall, and so somebody isn't going to be able to just get into your network from the outside. But making sure they can't do that is an absolute priority.
And certainly that can be laid as well. You might have sort of your gateway firewall, but then sort of by default, most PCs and servers sort of have their own host-based firewalls as well. That might be something like Microsoft Defender. It might be a third-party thing, but certainly using them in combination can be an excellent idea.
Yep. Patching, definitely keeping yourself up to date. Dan and I discussed this. I don't think we want to give you a recommendation that says you must keep your business systems patched the day the patch comes out, because sometimes those patches are faulty. And it's one thing to have your desktop lock up. It's another thing with a bad patch. It's another thing to have the entire radio station brought down because a bad patch that hasn't been tested knocks out your automation systems. But certainly if Microsoft or your favorite provider comes up and says, we've got a day zero threat, here is the patch for that. Day zero threats is where it's just been discovered, it hasn't been rolled into the regular patch, but we know we can fix this one exposure. Those things you probably want to get in straight away. Unfortunately, Microsoft with Windows these days makes it very difficult for you to apply patches selectively. You generally have to take the whole thing. So a topic for later discussion, definitely. Passwords. Oh my God. What can you say about passwords?
Passwords, have them for a start.
Yes, have them.
Yeah, there's still devices around, and these might be devices that have been within your broadcast network for years and years and years and years. And before, sort of automated crawling and network probing was such an issue, they might not have enforced the password at all. So that's a matter of guessing the username, possibly. I'd say the next worst thing there would be not changing the default password. We talked before about sort of several websites on the internet that'll sort of give you a listing of internet connected devices. If they're exposed on the internet, you can sort of immediately pull up their interface. And if you haven't changed the default password, the exact password will be listed in the manufacturer's documentation, usually.
Which is great if you're trying to fix something in a hurry and you can go to the manufacturer's documentation, but it's very bad if the device is exposed externally and has an unchanged password. It's not good at all.
That's right. And we've sort of been speaking as well about complexity of passwords. Probably at the moment, we won't go too much into it, but length and mix of characters is certainly important. There's a point where passwords of a certain length and complexity are trivial to sort of guess or crack.
Yeah.
Sort of well beyond the scope here, but yeah, there's a point where an extra couple of characters or a few symbols, things can jump from, taking a few days to crack to taking thousands of years.
By the way, a useful trick, because having a sufficiently complex but easily remembered password is a challenge in a volunteer organization. It's difficult to change passwords that legitimately need to be accessed by a lot of people, but you can use really, really cute human factored tricks, like have a password such as, and I don't have this password, but have a password such as, you're not going to guess this. So that when somebody says, what's the password? And you go, well, you're not going to guess this. And they go, no, I really need to know, what is the password? No, the password is, you're not going to guess this. Trivial as that sounds, that can be obfuscated enough whilst not making it impossible for people to be told what the password is and remember it very easily. So the best defense. Look, the best defense is, if the cyber criminals can use social engineering to trap you, then you need to be aware of social engineering and use exactly the same thing to resist the attack. Everybody in your organization needs to be aware that an attack is not only possible, but probable. And we kept being told it's not a matter of if, but when. Everybody in your organization needs to understand this is not a joke and it's not a movie script. It is actually very real and it could happen, and they need to be vigilant. And that just needs to be plugged into everybody. But you also need a culture that says, look, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen accidentally. And substantial number of attacks happen accidentally because somebody who really did know better accidentally clicked on a link. You're not going to further your organization's recovery by sending those people underground. You want people, if they do something accidental, to know this was expected, it's unfortunate, tell somebody straight away. So you need to have that culture in place. And we'll say that you can design a network, and Dan will talk a bit about this, you can design a network to be attack resistant, but it's actually much better to have a distrust culture, because that is in the long term going to be more effective than relying on an appliance that might itself be compromised and you don't know. So don't be a target. Have really good internal protocols for recovering. Hide yourself. This is one of the big challenges in discussing this topic. It's a bit like sexually transmitted diseases. They're there, nobody wants to talk about it. Because nobody's talking about it, nobody knows how widespread it is. Nobody knows actually how big the problem is or what to do about it. So there's a real challenge here between not exposing yourself to attack by being too public, but also by sharing the information should there be an attack. And certainly, should your station be attacked, contacting Technorama, contacting the CBAA, and do it privately if you want. Just find the right person to talk to and say, this has just happened. We are going to be building up processes to pass the information to the right people and to help you. Have a change register. Before any software is changed, make sure there is some sign-off process so that if something does get changed, you know that it was going to happen and you know what should have happened, and if it has been done by somebody who isn't you, that it wasn't supposed to happen. Don't have any back doors into your organization. If you find them, close them down. If you find somebody has a back door to make access easy, shut it down. It's not worth it. Pay for decent software. So there's been plenty of discussions on Technorama about how to make use of some of the software where, well, if there's only one person using it, use it forever, but we're using it through the whole organization. Sometimes it's not worth the risk. This is like insurance. You're going to pay the money. You don't know whether it's going to be improving your risk or not, but it's better than doing nothing. And particularly, don't trust anything that is free because it might have a payload. And a final one is, if you can do it within your organization, be non-typical. Have machines that are based on Linux because they're less likely to be hit. I don't use Microsoft Outlook. I use another email process. Makes life difficult for me sometimes, makes life difficult for other people, but it reduces the chances that I'm going to be hit, because when somebody comes along and wants to hack that, they're going to look at it and go, yeah, you know, too hard. I'll go to something that is easier. And hackers like low-hanging fruit.
That's right. So building on what John said, there's certainly a few things, that additional things that you can do, certainly some structural. This slide, we were going to talk a bit about network architecture, very in brief. But yeah, taking on sort of a layered approach, we've sort of talked about a mix of software strategies that can help. But similarly, your network can be partitioned, sort of moving down the layer to provide some extra degrees of separation between your services. This is a very simplified thing, but generally within your network, you might sort of buy yourself a switch. Everything will plug in, all your playout systems, your office machines, and out of the box, pretty much talk to each other, be able to communicate, and everything will just happily tick along. Things don't have to be set up that way. Certainly the vast majority of consumer, even professional switches and networking gear will let you design a system based on logical separation of network elements. So you might, it will sort of use existing equipment that you've got, but let you logically separate business processes into separate networks so that they can't, or without being mediated, can't communicate directly with each other. So you might, for instance, break out your business and office networks. All those machines can talk to each other quite fine. You might have your email attached to that, but you might create a separate virtual network purely for your broadcast equipment, where it can't ideally touch the internet, neither out nor in. There's different ways to handle that. And then you might create sort of another entirely separate network for your guests. Maybe they can only reach the internet. They can't reach servers within the organization. So that can just sort of be broken down to the nth degree. You can put all your servers on things. You can put all your codecs on things. You can put any internet connected devices in another zone. But that will certainly be a much more advanced thing. A station has to be able to set up and maintain that. So there's challenges, and it's going to be about picking what's going to be the most effective for your organization, for your capability. Certainly being able to maintain it is a concern. Certainly firewall appliances and hardware equipment can make life significantly easier. There's different grades of that. The little box that the ISP gives you is usually sufficient, I suppose, but
in most cases, it's going to be, it's going to be adequate. A basic natted router is going to protect you from 90% of everything. But if you have a much bigger network, then you might start looking at firewall appliances. Although, as we've seen, firewall appliances don't protect you from everything, and they don't protect you from somebody who's already managed to get onto the inside without going through the firewall appliance.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we've also talked about antivirus a little bit as well. In general, yes, that is going to provide a lot of protection. Most antivirus these days are sort of very, very active in research and development. They update almost constantly with either fingerprints of virus and malware sort of material. Gets sort of very tricky once you get into evolving viruses where sort of you might not get the same piece of malware as is already known. It sort of changes its shape over time. So there's sort of very clever ways that sort of modern and sophisticated antivirus can sort of pick up change.
Heuristic learning. So what do you do when the attack comes? The first thing is somebody is going to notice first. And this could be, strange behavior. In the case of a big network, an organization like a television station, there will generally be somebody who is in master control, is monitoring a screen that shows a whole lot of green. And when that green starts turning red, particularly when it all starts turning red at once, they know to escalate. Could be a bit harder to tell in the community radio station, but if somebody notices something a little bit odd, you should be encouraging them to say, this is weird, and I've noticed this on 2 machines, is that right? At that point, do you know what to do? We've discussed this. Powering down might be the right answer. Certainly ripping out the blue cable to isolate the device. If it's on Wi-Fi, you can't actually do that. So maybe powering down. Just isolating as quickly as possible seems to be a really good defense. And then as soon as you've done basic triage, escalate. And you need a plan in your station as to who could and should be told, who gets informed next. And I would say under all circumstances, because the worst thing that can happen to a radio station is silence, is you have some sort of emergency broadcast source.
Okay. Yeah, now assuming something does happen, you have to know who you're going to tell. Certainly the authorities, and there's many authorities. We might not have put ourselves on the same line as police and the Australian Computer Security Centre, Cybersecurity Centre. But certainly if you are under threat or have an attack, that is a crime. So, it might be damage to equipment, it might be data theft. Those are entirely legitimate crimes. It's not just an inconvenience to your station. So the police will be interested in that. You might even have a case to make an insurance claim for particular material. So having a police report on that will be useful. ACSC is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. They provide some national coordination on cyber threats and activity to Australia. They are very keen to have incidents reported. They might not necessarily jump in and help you recover all your data, but they'll be very keen to learn about it so they can.
And their website is very good for reporting. It's just very difficult to find them to talk to.
Yeah, we'll come to that. They provide fantastic resources, really. Some quite useful and specific to organizations of our size as well. Certainly you'll have to communicate with your station members. That can be difficult to do if you've lost access to some of your communication systems. But yeah, certainly staff and volunteers, they'll need to know what they're walking into or not. The amount of disruption to normal business operation is definitely going to need some strategy and thought. Listeners, often you might be able to go sometime without sort of making it too obvious, but I think eventually it's going to become, pretty clear that something's up. John?
That was really obvious with Nine. The first thing that happened was they had an 8 o'clock Sunday morning program that just couldn't go to air. There was no way to control anything. There was no way to get scripts. It was really obvious, really early to them. What they did was take a whole heap of heat on social media for people saying, why isn't this program running? Which is, might be unfair, but people complain about all kinds of stuff. The thing is, they came clean very, very quickly. And the following day, it was even a topic of conversation on Today's Show. They were making no secret of what had happened. So in some ways, they were enlisting the sympathy of their viewers whilst still maintaining good programs. So they handled the PR storm really, really well. Your listeners do at some point need to know if they are going to miss out on their favorite programs. And absolutely, if there's a data breach, the people who have been impacted need to know, and the Information Commissioner needs to know. You didn't need to put the whole URL here. If you just go and search on the web for OAIC, you will find out about the Information Commissioner, and this is for your protection as much as anything else. So now we come to the question, you've been attacked, should you pay? Mr. Dan, I have locked your entire household and I want $200,000. Could you please send me that money in Bitcoin? And the conventional wisdom is, nah, don't do it. This is a bit of a challenge because it's terrorism. And what you don't know is, even if you do pay, is the ransom request going to be honored? And so we've discussed internally the topic of the socially responsible criminal. And as I said earlier, some of the people who are after your assets just have a business model. All they want to do, and it's extortion, fine, but for them, it's a business model. They have help desks. They have ways of getting you back on your feet after you give them the money. Reprehensible as that might sound, it's actually a very sensible business model, and then they get out. And I've no idea why they don't get picked up by the authorities and shut down if they're being that public. But the socially responsible criminal will actually do that. The challenge is your machines may still be infected. You have no idea what's been left behind there, and therefore you could easily be a repeat target. And potentially, you're just putting yourself in the situation where you're encouraging cyber criminals. The decision of whether to pay is one that you need to discuss with, well, everybody who's involved inside your station. Can you afford it? Should you be doing it? And one of the cases that we looked at, a city that point blank, a city in the US that got hacked, point blank refused to pay the ransom, which was probably in the order of $200,000. They have reputedly spent $18 million recovering. So they've done the right thing, but have they done the right thing? And really, who knows? This is one that you can only ever know in retrospect. So definitely you need a plan B. If you've been hacked and you're off the air, what are you going to do? And absolutely the first thing that you should do is make sure your station has an appliance-based programming playout environment. What do I mean by that? A CD player is an appliance. A DVD player is an appliance. Even if it's attached to your network, it is unlikely to be hacked. So having a device that sits in the cupboard with a source of program material that can always be played is really smart. If your program is sitting on a USB stick, that can be hacked. A CD can't. So just think about what is the risk and can you cover yourself easily and cheaply? And indeed, having a DVD full of music, how many hours of music could you put on a DVD, Dan? Like a couple of days worth?
What's a DVD?
Yeah, you could have a week of programming on a DVD, just playing away at the transmitter site while you sort yourself out. Be really easy to do. The break glass procedure. So this is like, you know, the things where you go to the alarm and you break the glass and the fire brigade comes. That's the process. You need a process that says, if there is an emergency, what do people do? They go and do this. They tear the top off the envelope, pull out the paper, and it says, here are your instructions. And you need a plan, and the plan needs to be distributed, but it needs to be distributed a little bit carefully because, of course, if it's not distributed carefully, you might actually be leaving instructions for somebody to hack you. And don't forget that if you've got an OB kit, it actually represents a useful backup. You can go to air from your OB kit connected directly to the transmitter whilst your whatever is down. Backup and restore, Dan.
This is really the key message, but given that we're almost at time, we'll have to race through this. Everyone knows that they should have backups of their data. In a lot of cases, a lot of incidents can't be avoided. They're quite likely to happen. So really your backups are essential. Yeah, everyone knows they have to do them. There's many ways to do it. If you're not familiar with the 3-2-1 strategy, it's definitely worth a look up. It's about how you sort of separate your backups to give you redundancy between them. So in very brief, you want to have 3 copies of your data. 2 of those you want to be local. That can be your sort of production data, I suppose. Then a backup that you would have on site. And then another one that you would have offsite. Ideally, we've sort of highlighted cloud there. There's a lot of benefits to it, but a few challenges for stations in particular, mostly being the volume of data that we might have. It's media data, it's bulky, it takes a lot to transfer and upload, and I think critically to recover from when you're restoring a backup. You know, if you've got terabytes and terabytes of music data, it's going to take you a while to get that up and running. So the importance of a local backup in this sort of context is very important. I think this topic would be worth a whole different session down the track, comparing a few tools. Certainly Windows and major operating systems have tools built in. Some of them can be a little bit clunky. So there's a couple of other better solutions around as well, I think. Unfortunately, at a little bit of a cost, so there's trade-off.
It's insurance. And certainly,
that's right.
certainly you need to test. So many people take backups and never actually do a restore. Find another machine, do a restore, confirm that the backup actually works, because nothing is worse than having an incident, going to the backup and discovering that the restore process doesn't work. God, that is just so scary. There is plenty of information around. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre is a really good one, and their website has a whole heap of really good, sensible advice. It is, in my opinion, a bit of a pity that the centre itself seems not to be easily contactable, but if you do have an incident, they do have online collection from a form on the website. And if the incident is sufficiently important, I'm sure that they will get back to you. The appliance and software vendors will have information. So if you bought a box that is connected to the network, go and see what they say about attack. And certainly the opportunity to discuss on Technorama via Q&A and via the Technorama conferences coming up and through the CBAA. And Dan and I are now working to start setting up some processes within those organizations. There's also an article that is, well, it's actually the genesis of this session, which is on the Technorama website right now. So if you just want to go and send something to somebody, say, look, here's a starting point, send them that. Send your managers and your board this and say, look, read this, then let's have a discussion. This webinar is going to be available for replay. Tell your friends about it. And there are plenty of trade magazines. We found a couple, some of which would cover virus attacks and incursions very specifically, some of which wouldn't. I don't actually know if there is a magazine called Hacker Monthly, but I'd be surprised if there wasn't, really. And now, if we have a second, and there are some really high up questions, we might look at those. Otherwise, Dan and I go away.
I will just jump in here with the questions. Brett King asks, would you recommend any of the better practice cyber frameworks, for example, Essential 8, ACSC, ISM, NIST, ISO
27001. Weren't we afraid that somebody was going to ask us for that information? Dan and I are going to cry off from that one, but the questions are good because we can do some research on that. I don't think that's an answer that I would want to give right now.
I would say in general, yes. A lot of the ones listed in that particular question are sort of aimed at enterprise.
Yeah.
But you know, they're fantastic.
The Essential 8, I think, is the cybersecurity people's
Centre.
list, isn't it?
Yeah. So again, I'd encourage looking at sort of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. They've got some of that information that's been distilled into much more approachable and friendly material. I think one of the last slides had the small business guide, which sort of takes some of those some of those key concepts and sort of breaks them down and provides step-by-steps on
I like the question about reCAPTCHA on a network. Is that sufficient to say you are a real person? reCAPTCHA probably isn't intended to protect you against a cyber attack. It's intended to protect you against having a machine that is masquerading as a person. A real person trying to get through your site is going to get through reCAPTCHA in about 3 seconds because they're a real person. But it's a good question, and we can look at that and think about how you could protect your website against broader attacks, and that's probably a topic for a future highly technical session.
Betty from 897 FM in the northern suburbs of Perth asks, we talk about emails and networks, but what about websites with forms?
Well, that's exactly the question I just answered.
Yes, reading that when she said, is reCAPTCHA sufficient or are there better methods?
Yeah.
That's how clever you guys are preempting Betty's question. Thanks, Betty, for joining us here today.
Yeah, that could definitely be subject to another thing. I think if your website is built off the shelf, maybe CMS material, certainly future updates might have addressed that. They've updated sort of condition checks.
Excellent. I'll just jump in here. David Webb's asked the question: How do you ensure access to the automation system and broadcast desk by VPN when having an OB or broadcasting live from home? As we have to keep it secure.
And that's also a really good one. Yeah, lots of stations use VPNs and remote access tools to get access into the studio so they can manage the studio environment remotely during an OB. It's a really good technique. I think the first piece of advice, and again, it's a topic we can take up later, the first piece of advice is change the passwords. Don't leave the passwords lying around. Don't leave it open as a back door. Several of the major corporate attacks that we looked at, the first point of access was somebody had left a password to a trivial machine lying around, and that was used as a beachhead to go further. So don't leave the trivial stuff lying around.
Stephen Wilkinson, who many of you might know, who knows his way around IT stuff, puts forward the statement, institute multi-factor authentication for passwords.
And isn't that a vexed one? I got to tell you, I have an ongoing love-hate relationship with one of the banks that I deal with because they assume that multi-factor access is going to be via my phone or going to be via my email, which I might not actually have. So yes, think about multi-factor access, but also think about what's the worst case that could happen, and is it possible you're instituting something that in fact is unmanageable? And if the answer is yes, somebody who actually needs to get in might not be able to because they don't have the phone or they don't have email or they don't have, maybe you need a different process, a return phone call, something. But Stephen's absolutely right. Multi-factor access is a really good baseline consideration. So,
and I can't see any more questions in there, but if anyone does come up with any further questions that they would like answered, please send me an email, danny.chifley@cbaa.org.au, or sorry, rather, that's danny.chifley@cbaa.org.au. I will put my email address into the instant message box now. I'm also putting the link in there for the webinar feedback. I would very much appreciate anyone who's here today, if they've got 5 minutes here at the end of the session, if they're able to get on there and provide a bit of feedback. Let us know how we're going with our webinars, and also let us know what you might like to see here as part of future webinars.
Yeah, so we're looking at a whole range of things that we will now take based on demand, but you can continue the discussion on Technorama Q&A or by sending an email to any of us. It's a really good way to contact us. Danny, some stuff that's coming up.
Indeed. So I'll let you handle that first one that's coming up there.
Well, Technorama Tuesday. So every month we have a Technorama Tuesday webinar, and the next one is a topic that I just love, how do you talk to your board? And so often I have gone into a board meeting, they've asked me a question and the eyes have glazed over. So Ren Cuttress and Cameron Payne are going to be talking to you about how to communicate upwards as a technologist. And in fact, as a board member, how to understand what your technologist is saying. It is one of the most important conversations that doesn't take place way too often in community broadcasting. And what
Ren,
about the developing webinar talent?
developing volunteer talent, that one is. Ren
Sorry,
Cuttress
volunteer
returns.
talent.
Just to sort of be, obviously it's National Volunteer Week at the moment, so congratulations to everyone there at stations who's celebrating the fine work undertaken by volunteers. Hopefully you've seen on the CBAA Facebook page our National Volunteer Week People's Choice Awards that are open right now. If you want to get on and vote, do so. Just look for Community Broadcasting Association of Australia on Facebook. We'll be keeping the volunteer love going on 11 a.m. Tuesday, 15th of June, where Ren from 3MDR will be jumping into the session to talk about how to not only keep your volunteers interested and engaged, but keep that door open for future volunteers to come in. Volunteers don't have to be in the station as part of in an on-air capacity. They can be there doing all sorts of things there at your station. So hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you in that now. Please do feel free to sign up to the CBAA e-news for more information about all of our upcoming webinars.
So thank you very much to Danny in the wonderfully soundproofed studio there at the CBAA, and thanks to Dan. This has been a very interesting voyage of discovery, but this is just the starting point. Our intention here was to alert you, and the next step is yours. Tell us what's important, and particularly tell us if you've been hit. We'd love to know the story.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you very much to Michaela from the Community Media Training Organisation. Be sure they've got the calendar of all future webinars up on their website too, cmto.org.au. While you're there, why not sign up and increase your education here in the wonderful community broadcasting sector. Thank you too from the Community Radio Network, Dan Callahan, and from Technorama and so much more. Lowercase, just like he's in Silverchair, it's John Moses. We'll see you all next time. Take care.